Section 8, the chronology of the Olivet Discourse continued. In the previous sections, we started to study the cause and effect chronology of the Olivet Discourse and were able to review the major events that will occur in the first 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation period. That time period included events such as many false Christs appearing at its onset, followed by the rest of the beginning of sorrows, of wars, famines, and 1/4 of the population of the earth dying by various means. Next, we learned that collectively these beginning of sorrows were the cause that led to the next effect of the great persecution of Christians. The believers' response, therefore, resulted in effectively spreading the gospel throughout the earth. However, we learned also that the unsaved world's response to the great persecution of believers will be the great apostasy. In turn, the great apostasy results in the great delusion of the idol image of the beast being set up in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which enables the Antichrist to both claim and start receiving deity worship. In keeping with the Olivet Discourse's character of a cause and effect chronology, this idol image, this abomination that makes desolate, that is set up 30 days before the middle of the tribulation period, becomes the cause that leads to the next effect, which is a time of Jacob's trouble. If you remember, the people in the nation of Israel begin to actually have a major exodus out of their country upon this idol abomination being set up in their temple. It isn't until the 30 days later, at the precise middle of the 7-year tribulation period, that the Antichrist comes to realize the nation of Israel as a people will not worship him, and he breaks his covenant with them, resulting in what the Bible refers to as a time of Jacob's trouble that will continue for the entire last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. Now these are the words that the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. For thus says the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask now and see whether a man is ever in labor with child. So why do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor, and all faces turn pale? Alas, for that day is great, so that there is none like it, and it is a time of Jacob's trouble. In the book of Daniel, it is revealed that the Antichrist, 30 days after the abomination is set up, receives reports while he is in northern Africa that the nation of Israel as a people have not embraced him as their God, and he breaks the covenant that he had with them and attempts to annihilate them. He will extend his power against the countries, and not even the land of Egypt will escape. He will get control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the riches of Egypt. The Libyans and the Cushites will also be in submission, but reports from the east and the north will terrify him, and he will go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands watch over your people, will rise up. There will be a time of distress such as never has occurred since nations came into being until that time. The Antichrist is in view here in these verses, gaining power over one nation after another. East and north of these countries geographically happens to be the nation of Israel. Apparently, the Antichrist gets reports that the people of the nation of Israel will not worship his image, and with great fury he goes after them. Michael the archangel, who is identified as a mighty angel, is a protector of Israel in the spiritual world. According to this last verse of this text above, and other verses in both the 12 chapters in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation, the precise time of the length of this time of Jacob's trouble is identified. The prophet Daniel was the first to be told how long this trouble would last, but he did not understand it. Then I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river. He raised both hands toward heaven and swore by him who lives eternally that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. When the power of the holy people is scattered, all these things will be completed. I heard, but did not understand. However, the book of Revelation in the 12th chapter provides the insight as to the duration of this time of Jacob's trouble. First, it refers to the Jewish nation as a woman who births a son. He is the true Messiah, Jesus Christ, who will one day rule all nations. But before this son comes back to do that, the devil, through the Antichrist, seeks to destroy this woman, albeit Israel, who is given help to escape, to flee into the wilderness where she was taken care of. The woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God to be fed there for 1,260 days. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent's presence to her place in the wilderness, where she was fed for a time, times, and half a time. Notice that the duration of the time that the children of Israel go into this wilderness experience, according to these verses, is 1,260 days, which in prophetic years are made up of 30-day months that equate to 3.5 years. Why phrase the duration of Jacob's time of trouble with the words a time, times, and half a time? If we know now that its duration lasts for 3.5 years, then the word time, singular, equates to 1 year. The word times, plural, equals 2 years. If you sum them up with the remaining phrase of half a time, they total to 3.5 years. The evidence that Israel will endure a time of trouble that will last for 3.5 years is confirmed also elsewhere in the Bible. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those that worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. As has been mentioned previously, the Antichrist and his Gentile horde are the ones engaged in this persecution of Israel. It happens that 42 months divided by 12 months also equals 3.5 years. Another text, this time in Revelation 13, makes mention of these 42 months also. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. There are some people who hold that the book of Revelation has next to nothing in it that should be interpreted literally. What utter nonsense. To this point, one vivid example that dispels this presumption is how many ways does God have to enumerate for us that the nation of Israel will suffer a time of trouble for precisely 3.5 years. He tells us that it will last 1,260 days, or 42 months, or for a time, times, and half a time. And some of these enumerations he uses more than once. What speaks even louder than just this one example for much literalness in the book of Revelation is that many of the major signs and wonders that the book of Revelation reveal, Jesus Christ also revealed in the Olivet Discourse for this prophetic period of time, as well as do other scriptures in both Old and New Testament books in the Bible. These kinds of literal details help us to avoid convoluting one event with another and the timing of when these events occur. For instance, the persecution of Christian believers and the persecution of the nation of Israel are separate and distinct occurrences within the 7-year tribulation period. After the great persecution of Christian believers start to occur in the first half of the tribulation period, and the church goes underground to spread the gospel thereafter, the second half of the tribulation then shifts its focus on the nation of Israel, which begins to experience its persecution that does not end until Christ returns at the end of the tribulation, when Jesus regathers them back to the land of Israel. In looking at the chart that is before you in this slide, these two persecutions will occur as the fifth and eighth sorrow, respectively. They are not the same, as the start of their persecutions do not happen at the same time. This development of Israel's persecution in the second half of the tribulation period becomes now a cause that results in the next effect in the tribulation period. God responds to this persecution by the Antichrist and his followers against Israel by lashing out with what are referred to as the Great Tribulation judgments. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days shall be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. These judgments are comprised of the trumpet and vial judgments delineated in the book of Revelation, which start in Revelation chapter 8 and end in Revelation 16. If you have an interest to understand these great tribulation judgments, please read those chapters, as they will be not covered in detail here in this study. Although they will be horrific, they are presented in a simple, matter-of-fact manner that can be understood. Another way to understand the magnitude of these great tribulation judgments is the contrast that Jesus makes about them in reference to the beginning of sorrows. What started out at the beginning of the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period with the beginning of sorrows, or the beginning of birth pangs, have now escalated into the hard labor sorrows that Jesus labels as the great tribulation judgments that occur within the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. This is another reason why no one should break up the 7-year cause and effect chronology of the Olivet Discourse. No one should take out any of its major events and place the timing of those events to occur sometime outside a 7-year period. The point to keep in mind here is that the hard labor of the Great Tribulation judgments will thrust upon the ungodly a time like no other since the history of nations were formed. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as was never since there was a nation, even to that time. This is yet another scripture in the Bible that indicates that this will be a time like no other, and in doing so, it speaks to Michael the archangel's intervention to protect Israel. The book of Revelation expands upon this intervention. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was there a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil is come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has but a short time. As we return to Christ's words in the Olivet Discourse, they confirm also this time will be like no other. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of this world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Notice that unless God shortens the days within this period of time, that these great tribulation judgments would bring an end to humankind. The fourth trumpet, which is one of the great tribulation judgments, provides an insight into the shortening of days. Then the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. I spoke to a friend who is degreed as a nuclear engineer and inquired of him if the Earth started to rotate faster on its axis, resulting in 16-hour days, would that endanger humankind as we know it? And he thought not. Apparently, the way that God shortens the days is by reducing the hours in each day from a 24-hour day to a 16-hour day. That is precisely 1/3 of each day being shortened. God is not shortening the number of days, but rather the number of hours within each day. The last 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation period still will be comprised of 1,260 days, but reducing each day to a 16-hour day will reduce the overall duration of the last half of the tribulation period. Since the shortening of days does not begin at the precise middle of the tribulation period, but rather occurs at the sounding of the fourth trumpet, it means that we don't know how much time is reduced within the last half of the tribulation, but it may be as much as 1 year. In addition, God sending these judgments as retribution for the Antichrist and his Gentile horde persecuting Israel. These great tribulation judgments also function as a distraction from them actually being able to annihilate the people of the nation of Israel. The Antichrist and his kingdom will have their hands full trying to weather these intense great tribulation judgments. Similarly, these judgments will impede the Antichrist from negatively impacting Christians as they spread the gospel throughout the world until Christ comes. Also during this time, God provides Israel with assistance from two helpers referred to as the two witnesses, who actually are calling down these great tribulation judgments, which are indicative of the judgments that Moses and Elijah called down against the enemies of Israel in their respective lifetimes. It is for this reason that many believers are open to the idea that these two witnesses are Moses and Elijah, particularly based on how God ends the last chapter in the Old Testament, which is Israel's Bible. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. The last two names written in this last chapter are Moses and Elijah. In particular, there is a prophecy given here about Elijah coming back. To this day, the Jewish people, when celebrating their Passover dinner, which in modern times they refer to as a Seder dinner, have a seat at the table that remains empty. It is for Elijah when he returns. I imagine sometime within the tribulation period, Elijah may come to a Jewish household during a Passover meal, and to their amazement will sit down in that empty chair. And I suppose if Moses is with him, they'll be all too happy to add another chair to the table. And I will appoint my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from those people, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days and not allow their dead bodies to be put into the graves. Now, when it comes to the book of Revelation providing detail and literalness, try hard to grasp the following based on this text. I'm going to speak a little slower. We know that the second half of the tribulation period lasts for 1,260 days. However, since the ministry or testimony of the two witnesses is to last for 1,260 days, which ends in their deaths, and after their deaths, their bodies are left out in the street for an additional 3.5 days, which time the overall 7-year tribulation period did not end yet. then the beginning of the ministry of the two witnesses has to start not at the precise middle of the tribulation period, but at least 3.5 days before the middle of it. What this means is that God mercifully provides the two witnesses to begin to help Israel a few days before the Antichrist breaks the covenant with the nation of Israel at the middle of the tribulation period. How's that for God in the book of Revelation providing literal details so that we can come into this kind of insight? And just as much as when a woman completes her hard labor, it is a short time thereafter that her child is born, that's as much as after the world experiences the hard labor of the great tribulation sorrows, there is a short time before the birth of the kingdom occurs. This leads us to a study of the last of the major events that occurs within this window of time before Christ comes. There are 3 categories of signs that occur immediately after the Great Tribulation judgments have ended, but before Christ returns. The 3 categories of signs are signs in heaven, signs on the earth, and lastly, the sign of the Son of Man. First to occur are the signs in heaven. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has been not since the beginning of the world until this time, known or ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh will be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. This specific tribulation, it has ended according to this context in which these verses are found, is the Great Tribulation period and not the overall 7-year tribulation period. Also, this phenomenon of having the sun, moon, and stars darken is prophetically mentioned multiple times by Old and New Testament writers. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. Even here there is a sequence. Notice in particular in this text, and many of the texts that follow this, that signs in heaven impact the signs on earth. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. The Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost stated this prophecy, which was first prophesied twice by the prophet Joel in the Old Testament. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. The sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. The Apostle Peter once mentions this prophecy in his second epistle. But the day of the Lord shall come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works therein shall be burned up. The Apostle John in the book of Revelation, in the following 2 texts, gives us signs in heaven, but also specifically mentions signs on the earth. And I beheld, when he had opened the 6th seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heavens departed as a scroll, when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. In the book of Revelation, in chapter 16, it says, And the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightning, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nation fell, and great Babylon came into remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. For the windows from on high are opened, and the foundations of the earth do shake. The earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, the earth is moved exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage, and the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall, and not rise again. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once in a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth, and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. These now lead us to the last sign, the sign of the Son of Man. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. I say the last sign because this sign in effect is Christ returning in his one and only second coming. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. As we have previously studied, this is the day when the first resurrection, comprised of the just dead and the rapture of the just living, occur moments before King Jesus destroys the kingdoms of this ungodly world to set up the Father's kingdom here on earth. When we shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. As we reflect on the cause and effect chronology of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says to the generation who will be alive to see all of these things, that his second coming is about to happen. Conclusion and reflection. I end this entire study by borrowing from a few paragraphs that were stated in the introduction. Of all of the categories of prophecy that exist in the Bible, the one that has the most prophetic content is the 7-year tribulation period that includes the major signs and wonders that lead up to and include the second coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation period and the kingdom that immediately follows. In sharp contrast, consider that God gave Joseph in the Old Testament less than 1 chapter of biblical information and 7 years to prepare for the 7 years of famine. Similarly, he gave Noah less than 1 chapter of biblical information and 120 years to prepare for the flood. However, we have been given a plethora of prophetic biblical information and 2,000 years to prepare for the upcoming 7 years of the major signs and wonders that culminate in the second coming of Christ and the kingdom that immediately follows. Joseph and Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, by faith each prepared. When you consider the enormity of the particulars that God has revealed to us about this future prophetic period of time, there needs to be, just like with Noah and Joseph, a conscientious effort motivated by the gravity of these events to prepare. There is already underway one such conscientious effort that is being undertaken. The important topics, information, and insights that have been provided with these 8 sections of our study do not even come close to covering all of what this category of prophecy provides by way of information and insights. One burden behind producing this study was to demonstrate that it is pertinent to and given for New Testament economy of church believers, but it is being overlooked. Within our generation of time, a great majority of Christians are familiar with the rapture, but in contrast, a great majority of Christians are not as familiar with the second coming of Christ at the end of the tribulation period, when he returns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords to destroy the kingdoms of this world in order to set up the Father's kingdom here on earth. There are many different interpretations about the second coming of Christ and the timing of the rapture. My hope is that our study has not been so much about my commentary here in this work, but that you, through viewing many biblical verses within context, have come into the simple, matter-of-fact, intended interpretation of what the Bible reveals about many particulars surrounding the second coming of Jesus Christ and the rapture. Thank you.